So it's hard to imagine an analysis in which I'm far left and Destiny is not far left.
20 years later, research is starting to support that claim that Tom Cruise made 20 years prior, that there is no chemical imbalance in the brain.
I think that my stance on that would be, I don't really know right now how I actually feel about like SSRIs.
That it might actually be like civilization ending, to be super hyperbolic. But you got these small factions with very loud voices able to skew messaging. Like, a lot of people think that the left is absolutely crazy or the right is absolutely crazy because a tiny sliver, like 1 to 5% of those groups, are super loud and get a lot of attention.
I have recently been called far left by the polyamorous Cuban-American streamer, Stephen Kenneth Destiny Bennell Goranson II. In all seriousness, polyamorous Cuban-American, these are jokes. Destiny's a friend of mine, but a bunch of people sent me a clip during which the streamer, Destiny, is, I guess, talking about the space. Now, for those who aren't aware of how streaming content works, most of what's on the screen is a video game of some kind. I can't tell if this is Grand Theft Auto or Tetris or what it is. And then in the bottom right corner, that's the guy who we're going to hear from, Destiny talking. Here's what he had to say. Let's listen, and then we will discuss.
Everybody might try to sound like the Young Turks and David Pakman, but these guys are like progressives. They're like, on the ideological spectrum, I would say that like Steven Crowder is pretty far right, but the Daily Wire, Steven Crowder's further to the right than the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire represents a solid center-right conservative mouthpiece. Center-right conservative establishment, center-right conservative alternative media is the Daily Wire. There's nothing, like the closest thing would be center-left, my guess would be based on a little bit like Pod Save America or something. But like otherwise like alternative left media space, like everybody else is way left. The Young Turks is not center-left, they're far left. David Pakman is barely center-left, but more far left. You can't say the Young Turks are center-left.
Whoa. So, all right, there's some interesting stuff here. Now, the real story here, and this goes back to why am I talking about this? I'm talking about it because it's funny, but also I'm talking about it because I had this conversation when I was on Lex Friedman a few weeks ago. I guess it's been almost a month, it's crazy. We had this conversation about where is the left on the political spectrum, and the difference is like I'm to Joe Biden's left, but I'm certainly to the right of socialists, the way socialists are normally placed on the political spectrum, although I might take issue with that. The real story in hearing Stephen Kenneth Destiny Bennell II say this is that Destiny and I agree on almost everything. So it's hard to imagine an analysis in which I'm far left and Destiny is not far left.
Don't I say that I'm far left? I mean, I consider myself to be like center left, far left. I think Pakman is a bit to the left of me, but I think me and Pakman, I think, would probably align on most things, I think.
Call it what you want. Like either neither of us is far left or we're both far left. And
I feel like he thinks, I think in his mind, I think he heard me say far left, or I'm just making an assumption. Maybe I'm making an assumption about him making an assumption. It sounds like he heard far left as like an insult. I feel like I can't describe anything without people normatively loading all the language. I'm not trying to say far left is bad or far right is bad or center right is bad or center left is bad or any. I'm just saying like this is where people fall on the political spectrum in the United States right now.
I don't know if Destiny's being provocative or whatever the case.
I'm not even being like I don't even think David Pakman would disagree with a single thing I just said here. He might, right? David Pakman must see himself as far left on the American spectrum of politics, right?
I'm a progressive social democrat advocating for some way to get everybody health care, although I'm flexible on exactly how we do it, a living wage, campaign finance reform, we need environmental protections, we need to use progressive taxation to reduce inequality and fund social programs. These are not, number one, these aren't radical or fringe ideas, these are mainstream.
The social democracy in the United States is not mainstream. Absolutely not.
Ideas popular among most Americans if they are fairly polled, and the default sort of Northern European social democracy. So to say that that's far left doesn't seem super accurate. It is also true that as opposed to some on the
you guys have a really big problem in figuring out, like, I feel like on the internet, you guys don't know where any political spectrums are. Hold on, where? Somebody in my subreddit commented, this got so many upvotes. We're supposed to be like a political community, or maybe not. Maybe we're just a game playing community. Maybe that's all we do now. Labels are kind of a waste of time, but I don't see Pakman as far left. Policy-wise, he's probably slightly to the right of Elizabeth Warren. If that's far left, the Overton window is bro, Elizabeth Warren wants to 2x the minimum wage. She wants single-payer exclusive health care. I'm pretty sure she wants free education for the entire country, and I'm pretty sure she was in favor of a wealth tax. That puts Elizabeth Warren on the far left in every country on the planet, except for maybe some socialist South American, I don't know. But like everywhere in Europe, Elizabeth Warren would be far left. You guys online are insane. You guys are like, oh yeah, I'm in France, where the centrist party is talking about like a $50, whatever the currency is, minimum wage, or like exclusive single payer, no multi-payer system, like free education at the cost of entry for every single student. Like, bro, what do you guys are insane. This is literally the Bernie Sanders would be a centrist in Europe. Do you really think 15 an hour minimum wage is a far left position? Yes! What do you mean? I think 15 an hour in the United States of America is a pretty far left position, yeah. We might have been able to get support for a 12 an hour minimum wage, maybe 12 an hour, but 15 an hour died. It didn't make it hardly anywhere in the United States. it seems mainstream. Why does Destiny think he is so much better at gauging this than everyone else? Clearly his view isn't popular. My view's not popular online, because online you guys are young, you guys are white, and you guys are very left-leaning. So of course, in your eyes, like, oh yeah, well, where's the political spectrum? Like, let's see. This is the political spectrum for you guys. Right here is Biden, okay? Biden is like center-right, because he's a liberal. Here you've got AOC. Here is Elizabeth Warren. She's like maybe center left. And then kind of like medium leftish maybe is like Bernie Sanders. And then everything over here, which includes probably like 70% of the Democratic establishment, everything past here are Nazis. This is your guys' political spectrum, okay? You guys are fucked in the head. Yes, Destiny's obviously a lot more in touch with normal people and his peers. I think I am. Yeah, I do think so. Because I spent a lot more time in these spaces reading alternative content, or not alternative content, reading content that is belonging to political opposites than you fuckers obviously do. You guys are actually insane. Elizabeth Warren was far left on the Democratic platform for nominees. Like, she was literally one of the far left candidates. What are you talking about?
So-called far left. I'm not a dogmatic ideologue where I blindly follow a party line or get involved in tribal identity, and that makes me like Destiny. I think he also doesn't do that. I've been critical of the Democratic Party, I've been critical of the progressive movement, I've been critical of corporate media when it is appropriate, like Destiny. I also regularly engage with people from different parts of the political spectrum, different backgrounds. I've done the Joe Rogan show twice, did Lex Friedman, I was on the Patrick Bet-David podcast, the Trump supporter, etc. What you also have to understand is that there's a movement in the US, the right wing, that calls what I just described far left. I think that they're wrong. There's a movement in the US and globally, socialists, that call my views center left. I put myself between center left and far left because we're sort of forced into this political spectrum. But the funniest thing about all of this is...
Oh, so he doesn't even disagree with me.
that Destiny's views and my views line up almost exactly on most issues. As far as I know, he supports many of the same policies I do. He once praised me as a left-wing commentator who's reasonable and intellectually honest. So if I'm far left, I think Destiny is also far left. Now, I will say one other thing, and this is speculation, okay? And I'll talk to Destiny anytime. He can't, I guess, go on my Twitch streams because he's banned on Twitch and it's a whole mess, but I'd love to talk about this. Destiny might label me as far left because he may be going through a period of distancing himself from the progressive wing.
He heard far left and then his brain is like, oh, Destiny's like attacking
of the left, and he may want to appeal to a more centrist audience. I don't know if that's the case. I'm speculating. I also think that there's a false equivalence between even comparing the Daily Wire to the David Pakman Show, because the Daily Wire is a right-wing propaganda outlet that is out there to spread disinformation and to fearmonger on a daily basis, and they are funded by millionaire donors who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and undermining democracy.
Okay.
You're familiar with The Boy Who Cried Wolf, I'm sure, and there's two kind of parallels within there. There's the obvious parallel being you shouldn't lie because false in one thing, false in all things. Mm-hmm. But then there's the other parallel of when do you trust a liar? How many times can someone be wrong before they are no longer trusted? So the people in the village of The Boy Who Cried Wolf didn't fire the guy who was hired to look for wolves, and he kept calling wolf. So the one time he calls for wolf, and then the wolves are actually there, the entire village loses their whole flock because they didn't trust the guy who called wolf. Uh-huh. So you have companies like CNN and Fox that constantly lie, and CNN kind of looks at Fox and kind of checks Fox. It's kind of CNN's job to say Fox is lying here. It's kind of Fox's job to say CNN is lying here. And you had a conversation a long time ago about Tom Cruise and the pharmaceutical industry when he was on Matt Lauer acting like a fool, and you said that Tom Cruise was right. I forgot the analogy you used. It was a good analogy, but you said Tom Cruise is like a broken clock, essentially, that he constantly says that the pharmaceutical industry is wrong and they're doing evil stuff, and every now and then he's going to be right. But in this instance, he had a very specific claim that I feel might have actually been the boy crying wolf and there was actually a wolf. He said that there was no chemical imbalance in the brain. That concept isn't real. And he looked at the research, and the research didn't prove that point. And then later on, like 20 years later, research is starting to support that claim that Tom Cruise made 20 years prior, that there is no chemical imbalance in the brain.
I think that my stance on that would be, the way that I would phrase this is, I would say there probably is a chemical imbalance, but when people talk about chemical imbalances in the brain, I think people are too keen to talk about a chemical imbalance like a biological deformity that is like hard set. So like people will say a chemical imbalance in the brain is like having a sixth or seventh finger, whereas I think the chemicals in your brain are constantly changing, right? So like when you have an orgasm, that causes a quote unquote chemical imbalance in the brain, or when you sleep in too much, that causes a quote unquote chemical imbalance in the brain. So I would guess that like mental illnesses probably result in or result from different kinds of chemical imbalances, but these are very malleable based on your like daily behavior. They're not like hard set in stone, you know? So I'm guessing Tom Cruise would probably agree with that. When he says there's not a chemical imbalance in the brain, what he probably means, and what I would interpret it as, or what I would hope so, and what I would say is that there might be behaviors or environmental cause or diet things or whatever that are causing your brain neurochemicals to be a little bit off, and you should probably do what you can within your environment to change that without relying on necessarily like a drug to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would agree with that.
Yeah, recent research and everything I've seen, I felt a little cautious saying this, but like I don't really know right now how I actually feel about like SSRIs. Like whereas before I'd always say, listen, you should do it. It doesn't help that much, but like at least a little bit plus therapy is good. I'm a lot more on the fence, even like recommending them at all now. To where if a friend tells me like, oh yeah, like I went to a therapist, I think I'm gonna get on SSRIs. Like I would usually encourage like you should really exhaust every single option before heading down that route, because it's a scary route to get locked down. But yeah.
Yeah. I'll agree with your take there. I'm not an expert in this topic, and I don't pretend to be. But
I do.
Going back to
pretend to be.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah, going back to The Boy Who Cried Wolves. Scientology constantly cries wolves about the pharmaceutical industry. But if the pharmaceutical industry messes up, if they have some type of error where they mess up, the CDC is not really in a position to properly monitor large pharmaceutical organizations like Pfizer or anything like that, because they take such large paychecks from those pharmaceutical industry. So it's going to be a terrible situation.
I don't know if I would agree with that. The CDC takes large I don't know if this is necessarily like a huge building block to your point, but I don't think I would agree with that, but go ahead.
It could be wrong, but from what I've read, about 40% of all of the CDC's revenue comes from fees that they charge pharmaceutical industries to get their medications approved.
Sure. So while that might be true, that's markedly different than like, because the other thing kind of sounded like, oh, they're just like paying them off or whatever. Also, I mean, the CDC is an executive branch agency. I mean, they could raise government funding if they needed, but yeah, I'm sure they charge fees to it. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just under the assumption that if you're paying someone to approve your drugs and they're taking paychecks from you, it's a compromise of integrity there. Now, whether or not that has an impact on any pharmaceuticals, I can't answer that question. But just from a high top level, if Company A is being overwatched by Company B and Company A is paying Company B, then for me, there's a conflict of interest there.
Yeah, I could see that kind of being the case. I think some fee is probably important, right? Otherwise, you could have a million companies that are all just like trying to get drugs passed or whatever, like wasting the CDC's time. So
yeah,
agree that some fee, some sort of like price holder is probably important. Yeah, and then the second thing would be like, is the CDC reliant on these funds to operate? Because my understanding is that as an executive agency, they could always raise money from the government, right, if they needed to, but.
Yeah, it's highly possible that it's just greedy pigs within the organization taking extra cash, and that they're still doing their job perfectly fine. I can't prove that.
Well, also, hold on, it's important. We have to get really into the weeds on some of these. When we say greedy pigs taking money, the CDC fee structure, it's not like the money is being paid to people working in the CDC, right? Like you don't get like a huge cash bonus for like approving a drug or something, do you?
No, but you can expand your organization. So within the government, every governmental organization, one of their prime objective is to expand their own organization, more people, more money, more resources. So just kind of ballooning up their organization with those fees. So
I'm sure that can happen, but I don't know if I'd say that's a primary goal. Right? If that was the case, I felt like we would have expanded the IRS so long ago, but that organization has been kept so small compared to what it probably should be. Although, I don't know if you would agree with that. You sound a little libertarian, so maybe we would fight on that point. But like, I mean, I know agencies want to expand, but I mean, you would have, those are like fights you have to have in Congress for that, no?
Yeah, you would win that argument. I think the IRS is heavily underfunded, but I don't support funding the IRS simply because I don't believe as an organization they have the ability to target the proper targets.
Okay.
If you fund the IRS more middle class people and people kind of inching into wealth like yourself are probably going to be the ones they target. They're not going to target the proper targets, which is corporations subverting the entire tax system through loopholes. And no one's going to address those loopholes. Trump didn't.
We got to be careful. Like, it's not the IRS. The IRS's job is enforcement of the tax code. It's not to like rewrite the tax code or to break people that aren't breaking the rules or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah,
the IRS
correct.
shouldn't be busting people using quote unquote loopholes, because loopholes are, you're implying that it's a legal method of tax avoidance, right?
Yeah. So because of all the legal methods of tax avoidance, expanding the IRS is primarily going to target people that I view should not be targeted by the IRS. Regular mom and pops doing their small businesses that are probably skimming taxes a little bit, and they will get caught with more IRS agents, and the IRS will get more income and revenue. But I don't really feel that those people should be getting targeted by the IRS, because obviously taxes are a little bit unfair in America, and that would be my only pushback on there.
Gotcha. I would disagree with all of this, but you can keep going. I don't think we have to fight on every. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're probably 80% aligned and 20% disaligned from what I've seen of your show. I mostly watch it at 2.0 speed after the fact.
Gotcha.
I think you're a little too trusting in organizations, and you could very well be right, and I could be wrong. But for instance, like Pfizer holds the record for largest monetary penalty for a drug they produced that killed a bunch of people.
Which drug was that?
And oh man,
Oh, you don't. I don't need that name. I'm just curious. Like, what do you know? What kind of drug it was or whatever? I just haven't heard that before.
It was Bextria, I believe, Bextra.
Gotcha.
And that was from Pfizer, and they hold the record for penalty. So obviously the FDA did their job in saying this drug is now killing people, but they also approved that drug.
Sure.
But going back to the Boy Who Cried Wolf, it would be a sad state if Scientology is accurate in pushing back against the pharmaceutical industry, because Scientology should be the last place anyone goes to for truth or reason or logic. And if Tom Cruise actually was right, if Scientology, because they probably put a lot of resources into finding their enemy's weak points, and their enemy is the pharmaceutical industry. So what if Scientology actually found a legitimate weak point in that chemical imbalance, which was largely used to push SSRIs? What if Scientology was right and Tom Cruise was correct, that he read the research, and in that research they were wrong and every other institution missed it?
I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be that surprising. I tend to look at like, well, what are the incentives lie for Scientology? Like, we're pushing a lot on like Scientology being correct here, but arguably every single like alternative medicine system would also be right? Like acupuncturists, chiropractors, Ayurvedic medicines, like all of those people would also be correct too, not just Scientology. It's not like they found something novel or something that nobody else discovered, right?
Well, that's kind of where my point was going with Tom Cruise's specificness of the claim. It's not ultra specific. It's kind of broad, saying that the specific claim of chemical imbalance in the brain was incorrect.
Sure. To
But
be
it
fair,
is a
I mean,
little-
like, it is fairly specific, I guess, yeah. But to be fair, like, it's always been, like, the serotonin idea of depression has always been relatively contentious. Like, it's been something that has been very, very, very heavily researched. And I want to say, wasn't it last year a really big study was published that super challenged the idea that it even had to do with serotonin imbalance for depression? I thought that was a really big thing that came out last year. I'd have to look again.
Yeah, I believe you're correct. And the human brain is so odd, and it's the least understood thing in the entire medical field. People seem, I'm sure you've heard, but when people win the lottery, they're only happy for about a week, and then they seem to bounce back to whatever that base level of happiness that they have is.
We acclimate very quickly to bad and good things. I was surprised, even for people that get like crippled and like lose loss of leg and limb and shit, they can still report like being pretty happy like a few weeks later. Like they catch up like very quickly. It's pretty crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been a happy person my entire life, and when I was 21, I got kidney failure.
Jesus.
And I was in dialysis, having a blast, playing my DS, playing a bunch of strategy role-playing games while I had these IVs hooked in my arm to filter my blood, and I was totally fine and happy, where other people, if they got kidney failure at the age of 21, probably would have went into some type of depressive situation. And trying to attribute that to some type of chemical balance in the brain, I imagine is going to be a nearly impossible task. And then when you take things like SSRIs, or let's just use Ritalin to use a name, I think Ritalin will work on most people regardless of whether they have ADD or a chemical imbalance.
Sure. I mean, we've seen that with amphetamines in general. They give people great concentration, right?
Yeah. So how are we going to test whether or not those are effective if they're always going to work?
Well, I think the idea is the challenging part is you have to establish some sort of baseline, and then from the baseline we try to figure out like where people should be. So there's like a baseline we expect for people to be attentive or to have executive function control or whatever, and the people that fall beneath that baseline we medicate up to what we imagine the baseline to be, right?
Yeah. And do you think the pharmaceutical industries are doing the proper testing to identify people's like happiness baseline and the impact of those drugs after the baseline? Or do you think they're just looking for the end result, which is an improvement in focus and or happiness?
Well, they're looking for the improvement, right?
Yeah, and if that improvement always happens, I'm not necessarily against Ritalin or any of those drugs, but if the improvement always happens, I think it might be a false corollary to say
is the
that
happiness thing true?
Ritalin is a drug
like 6 days ago.
that is designed specifically to help something like ADHD.
Well, I don't know if I would say it's designed specifically to help ADHD, right? It's just something that improves focus, and people with ADHD need like improved focus, right?
Yeah, says the current literature.
Yeah, according to
Yeah, and your take on the CDC is probably pretty accurate, and it was very similar to your take on the WikiLeaks within Twitter. A lot of people on the right were pretty stupid to try to jump down the government's throat for paying Twitter. But obviously, as you said, and you were completely correct in this matter, if you're going to request a company do a job for you, do a task for you, you have to compensate them. So I don't think there was any malfeasance in the government paying Twitter to look at their specific request.
Sure.
And that's kind of similar with the CDC taking pay cut or paybacks or whatever you want to call them, taking fees for being able to approve medical drugs. Because Pfizer could dump out 30 different drugs in a single month if they really wanted to, but then they have to pay for all 30 of those drugs to get looked at.
Sure, yeah, and they wouldn't be able to pass the... also, it's not the CDC; it's the FDA that does approvals for drugs on finally, right? They wouldn't be able to get all those drugs through, right?
Yeah. I kind of lump them all together. I don't know exactly the role difference between the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH. They all kind of overlap a little bit.
I mean, maybe similar-ish missions, but the final approval for drugs, like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, those are the FDA processes, right?
Yeah, I guess Food and Drug Administration. Yeah. So the false in one thing, false in all things. I think it's a pretty big problem within this society because I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I have a little bit of knowledge about a lot of stuff, but not a lot of knowledge on any particular topic. And I find the news to be inaccurate so frequently about topics, just constantly inaccurate about topics. So I distrust them for that reason alone. But obviously, they're going to be right about a lot of different stuff. Like, what do you think would be a solution forward to alleviate the problem of false in one thing, false in all things?
I mean, like I said, I kind of say like you have to see where like the incentives lie, because that'll usually tell you more often than not what people are lying about or why people are lying. Is what are they incentivized to lie about? So, for instance, if somebody, if you ask a kid, for instance, like, did they stay up late last night playing video games? Are they going to lie to you? Well, the incentive is there for them to lie because it sounds like they're going to get in trouble if they say yes. But if you ask a kid, like, did you eat breakfast? Or maybe an innocuous question, did you see Frank today at school? Maybe they're less likely to lie because the incentive's not there for the lie to happen. So I think looking at like what people are incentivized to say or what the rewards or punishments are behind certain answers can give you somewhat of an indication of how reliable a statement might be. That's why one of the things that frustrates me a lot is people will say mainstream media lies, and they'll say that all the time, and they'll say they're paid off to sell you like a certain opinion, or they're something like that. And I always challenge people because alternative media is also heavily incentivized to lie too, because the more sensational you are and the more you can contradict mainstream media, the more payments you get for it. You collect rents for that kind of, right? Like if I, yeah.
I love that response, but how do you, I don't know the word. That response in relation to Pfizer and the jab, they have tons of incentive to lie about the performance of their vaccination. So the incentives are all there. So why are you so willing to trust Pfizer with the vaccine when their incentives are to lie?
Yeah, so the ideal is that, like, I'm not trusting Pfizer, I'm trusting the peer review process and the government, because those are supposed to be the two big checks on their behavior.
Yeah, and you're probably correct in all of that. I have my own, as I said, I had kidney failure, so I did a whole lot of research on why I didn't get vaccinated, and it has nothing to do with the reasons everybody else didn't get vaccinated. Mine are completely separate and different. So I'd like to hold myself a little bit above the anti-vaccine crowd in that regard. But I lost my train of thought on where I was going with that.
Sure.
Because I didn't really want to talk about vaccinations. I mostly wanted to talk about the boy who cried wolf and the...
Well, I guess I'm curious about that. Especially, I'm guessing you're somewhat immunocompromised then, or no? Or
yeah, I got a kidney transplant from my sister, and I take immunosuppressant medication.
Yeah, so that your body doesn't, until it rejects the kidney.
And my body doesn't reject it. So in order for the vaccination to work, it has to trigger an immune response within your body. And people that are immunocompromised have a lower chance of the vaccination actually being effective, but all of the risk factors of the vaccination are still present.
Sure, but are you not worried about the risk factors of actually getting SARS-CoV-2, of getting COVID-19, of, I don't know what variant we're on?
No, I work from home and I don't leave. If I
That's fair.
was in, if I was in a service industry job, I probably would have gotten vaccinated. But I am a business intelligence analyst. I work from home. I rarely leave the house. I love staying dormant in my little crab cave, and so I don't have a high level of exposure. And I got COVID from my wife in December for the first time, and it was obviously the more mutated COVID, so it wasn't as strong as the initial COVID. And I was better in like a day. It didn't really impact me, but I do everything from my own sort of logic, and it doesn't always work. My logic is obviously flawed sometimes, as is everybody's. But the most ideal situation for my current circumstance would have been not to catch COVID and not to get vaccination. So I was shooting for that ideal outcome, which is no risk from the vaccination, no risk from COVID. Just by not catching COVID, not getting vaccinated. And then the next lower possible outcome is getting vaccinated, not getting COVID. And then for me, the worst solution would be getting vaccinated and getting COVID, because that would have been a double dip inside of the risk category.
Well, not necessarily. I think the order of risks are, your biggest risk is no vax, then COVID. Your second biggest risk is vax and COVID. And then your third risk is just vaccinated, right? And then your fourth risk would be doing nothing.
I think we'll just slightly disagree on that risk.
Unless you believe that unless you think that the vaccine is ineffective at staving off any of the more serious medical conditions or complications or hospitalization, I guess.
I work with data a lot, and I'm not an expert on how they measured, because one of their big claims, first they said that it was like 95% effective, and it might have been for like the first couple of weeks of COVID, and then it dropped off heavily. So the COVID vaccination wasn't that effective in the later years of COVID. So then they pivoted.
Real quick, just to clarify these. So it might not have been effective at getting you not getting the disease, but my understanding is even in the later stages of whatever variant we're at now is highly effective in preventing hospitalization. Is what it's generally argument for, I think. But go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing I want to talk about is the measurement. So they pivoted to the phrase greatly reduces hospitalization and death, I believe is how they phrase that. But I'm not sure they have the data points in place to actually measure the impact of COVID for a vax person and a non-vax person, how sick they get. How do you measure how sick someone gets in COVID in a valid, data-centric manner?
I thought the sickness was just how likely were they to have to go to the hospital once contracting COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that could have been their measurement, but then every hospital counts that stuff differently, and every state reports that stuff differently.
Well, the counting will be like, are you in the hospital? Do you have COVID, right? And then how many people tested positive that didn't go to the hospital? Like, I think that if you, because my understanding was, I don't have the studies offhand, but my understanding is that when you, like, I'm just throwing out bullshit numbers, but like, let's say like 80% of the population in the United States is vaccinated. When you looked at the people that were being hospitalized, it would be like 20% of them were vaccinated. So the people that were going to the hospital were much more likely to be unvaccinated than the average population, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's the understanding that the pharmaceutical industries put out, because they were primarily involved with setting up those research studies and stuff like that. And they have a big incentive for that vaccination to continue working, even though it didn't stop the spread. And I'm not going down like a conspiratorial mindset. It's just that the incentives exist for Pfizer to lie about their pharmaceutical effectiveness of their medication.
Yeah, and I agree with that. That's why we have the FDA. That's why we have peer review, right? You would never just trust technically you should never trust any company ever, unless you're hoping they're just trading by reputation. But like, you would never just say like, oh, well, we trust this company because it's, companies are good. You would say we trust the company to make a product, and then we have our government agencies, and then the peer review process that hopefully is a check on that product. That's like the goal, right?
Yeah, and I think our biggest difference between you and I is I view the FDA, the CDC, the NIH as all corporations that should also not be trusted.
Well, sure, but you don't have to quote unquote trust them. You're just checking their incentives against each other, right? Like, for instance, like, I don't trust, like, if I was a third party, I might say I don't trust the United States and I don't trust China. You cannot trust both of those people, but you would absolutely trust them to call each other out, right? So I might say, like, I don't trust the US and China. They're both liars. However, if the US does something and it's wrong, China will absolutely catch that, because they're not going to lie about everything, right? They would call out the United States without, like, if they thought they could expose a flaw in the US reasoning, right? That would be my thing. So I might not trust necessarily, like, I don't have like maximum trust in the FDA or whatever, or maximum trust in a corporation, but the FDA's job is to do big trials and to make sure that like drugs are of a certain safety threshold. So you would trust them to do that, or I would. I understand. I guess maybe you wouldn't, but yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't, because as we were talking about the false in one thing, false in all things, the FDA totally let that drug Betrix onto the market and it killed people. So they dropped the ball there, and the FDA, not the FDA, but yeah, the FDA. The FDA has dropped the ball so many times.
Well, hold on. You might. I'm not familiar with that drug you're talking about. That might be one example of the FDA dropping the ball. But in other examples, the FDA was better than the EMI. I forget what it's called in Europe, where they do drug approvals, because we caught I think thalidomide, thalidomide. I don't know how it's fucking pronounced. Which was something that I believe got approved in Europe, that I think was like killing fucking babies or something, right? But but in the United States it didn't get through as much, or I don't think it was approved at all in the United States. So that's one example of a drug that we didn't approve that got approved in Europe that was causing harm in Europe, I believe, and then we didn't. So I mean, like, I'm sure the FDA is not perfect. There's gonna be times when drugs get through that shouldn't, but or gave babies birth defects or something.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit on my end. But,
oh, sorry. What I'm saying is that there are drugs that the FDA hasn't approved that have been approved in other places in the world that were ultimately harmful. So, I mean, in some places the FDA might drop the ball, in other places the FDA might do a better job than in Europe.
Yeah. And that's difficult on society, because as like CNN will create a fake news story about whatever, or Fox. I grew up through the Obama years, thanks Obama, so I saw Fox News lying over and over and over, and then I also saw CNN lying over and over and over again. So these institutions, not that Fox and CNN are institutions, but they kind of are. A lot of these institutions have been wrong on pretty large instances, which kind of erodes the trust in the FDA. And I would like to have maximum trust in our institutions like you do, but I've seen.
Well, hold on. To be clear, I don't have maximum trust. Like, I think it's good to call them out and to be careful about them, and understanding they could be right or wrong at some points in time. I mean, really, all they have to do is beat random chance. But I mean, 51% isn't good. But
yeah.
The idea is that hopefully they're trying their best. They're probably going to make mistakes at some points, but it's better than trusting other people in media who have a whole bunch of incentives to lie in different ways that aren't necessarily in the interest of the American people without like a governmental check on them.
Yeah. Sorry for mischaracterizing your position. I didn't mean maximum trust. I
Sure,
just
yeah,
meant
that's fine.
I wish I could trust the FDA as much as you trust the FDA.
Sure.
But because of all the things I've seen throughout our society of large corporations, large institutions lying for profit and, like, I guess, business clout.
Well, yeah, but like, aren't you kind of a product of a successful medical regulatory environment? Like, you were able to get a kidney transplant. You're probably on some immunosuppressant drugs for quite a while. Like, a lot of this stuff, the drugs that you're on were approved by the FDA. The procedures that you were put through to do the transplant and everything, all of that are probably overseen by some medical institution. I don't know if the FDA does that. Like, wouldn't you be an example of like a success story of that?
To some extent, but I've also had some pretty traumatic experiences from the failures of that. I got heparin poison and almost died in 2008. China released a bad batch of heparin to a large portion of the United States. And when you're on dialysis, they use heparin to thin your blood out. Mm-hmm. And I had a batch of bad heparin that wasn't caught by any of these institutions and almost died from that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like, it might not be perfect, but like, absent these institutions, you would be dead 100%, right?
Oh yeah. I'm not a Luddite or an anti-advancement or any of that.
Sure.
I'm mostly just concerned about the ability of society to reject institutions because the institutions have proven themselves very capable of massive failures, and the internet allows those massive failures to get expanded in such a large degree that there's going to be swaths of people that are now anti-vax because of the handling of COVID. And I think that is like one of the worst situations we could be in as a country and a society.
Sure, but then, I mean, like, there are massive successes as well. You just have to balance it out. If you are unhappy with the system, not to do a nirvana fallacy here, but like, I'm curious, what are some alternatives or what are some changes that you would say should be made?
Oh, well, I definitely think they need to be more transparent with the research. They try to get the research to be released from Pfizer, and I think they tried to say they'll release it in 150 years.
Isn't that like, I'd have to go and check, but like, in terms of like all the peer-reviewed research for like medical outcomes, my understanding is that information is all totally open. That whole like 150-year thing, I thought it was to do like very specific formulations of like a vaccine or whatever. That's not like it's not information that has ever been released before, necessarily like needs to be available to know like the safety factor or anything of any of these drugs released. I could be wrong on that. I have to look that up, but I saw that claim a few times.
Yeah, I think I disagree with you because of the way Project Warp Speed allowed Pfizer to do a lot of their own testing independent from other testing organizations to push that drug through a little bit faster.
I'd have to see specifically what Warp Speed did. I know obviously it's called Warp Speed. The goal was to make it a little faster, but I don't know if any of the safety steps were actually skipped over or not. Like, they still did the phase 3 trials and everything, right? Like,
yeah, but in those phase 3 trials, they were pretty limited. For instance, I dug through and I tried to find the testing for kidney failure patients who had kidney transplants, but they only had 12 people that had end-stage renal disease, which is a little more broad than kidney transplant. End-stage renal disease encompasses people that haven't had a transplant and people that have had a transplant. That just means their kidney function is below a certain threshold, and there's only 12 of them in the initial study within the Pfizer mRNA vaccination. And for my particular bracket, there wasn't enough information. And then they didn't include a lot of the data that I would have liked to see in order to make an educated decision on whether or not I get vaccinated.
Gotcha. Is it generally a contraindication if you have renal failure to not get vaccinated? Is that ever...
Yeah, I'm not one of those dorks who's going to say their doctor told them not to get vaccinated. My doctor totally said, yeah, you should get vaccinated. And we had long conversations about the effectiveness of the vaccination. And he was like, you are of the highest risk. You should get vaccinated the most. Your body is probably not going to create a good immune response to the vaccination. So you should get vaccinated and then have your antibodies tested to see if the vaccination took. And if it didn't, then you should get revaccinated or get a booster relatively quickly to try to get your immune system up to scuff and to get it to actually grab onto that spike protein and incorporate that into your immune response.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious because like the idea of like I would have wanted to see more renal failure people tested, I guess, with a vaccine. I'm curious if having renal failure or having these types of complications are generally contraindications for getting vaccinated. Like, it'd almost be like saying that, like, I wanted to get vaccinated, but I didn't see that they tested a lot of Star Wars The Next Generation fans to see how well they were vaccinated. So I decided not to get it. And I'm curious, like, is that like a contraindication for getting a vaccine as being a Star Wars The Next Generation fan? Because if it's not, I don't know why we'd want that particular data before going down that road, I guess. That's what
I think for this particular instance it is, because that spike protein was supposed to only be retained within the area where the shot was taken, but it was proven the spike protein was actually released throughout the entire body. So they found like that spike protein in women's uteruses, and they found the spike proteins in other parts of organs. And I am unsure what that spike protein is going to do in my transplanted kidney if that spike protein gets into my transplanted kidney with all of my immunosuppressant medications. Now,
yeah,
obviously,
but I mean, like, wouldn't you be worried then about like the much higher amount of that spike protein that would go through your body if you actually got a COVID-19 infection? Like,
yeah, except for the fact that I wasn't in a high risk category of getting the infection because I worked from home and I rarely left. I had all my food delivered and all that stuff. COVID was fantastic for my lifestyle as a cave goblin.
But but ultimately you still got it, right?
Yeah, my wife went out to a bunch of parties, but I got it in December and it didn't have much of an impact.
Sure.
And I'm not of the thinking that if I would have gotten vaccinated, anything bad would have happened. The odds are super low. And because of the way the internet projects things, you can have 10 people have a reaction to the vaccination out of 300 million people who took it. And then those 10 people are able to go on these alternative media sites or go on the internet and tell their story and make it seem like a lot more people are getting these adverse reactions than actually happen.
Sure.
And I think the function of small minority groups having a much larger voice than they actually represent has been exacerbated by the internet to such a degree that it might actually be like civilization ending, to be super hyperbolic. But you got these small factions with very loud voices able to skew messaging. Like, a lot of people think that the left is absolutely crazy or the right is absolutely crazy because a tiny sliver, like 1 to 5% of those groups are super loud and get a lot of attention. But that's not what is the reality. We're not seeing reality on the internet for the most part.
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily disagree, yeah.
Yeah. And so because reality is so hard to grasp, I think it's made people like myself highly skeptical about reported facts by institutions.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can sympathize, at least, yeah.
Yeah.